welcome to Redefining ABCD.
So, today for Brown Art Network, the focus of our conversation will be surrounding the art and of travel and experiencing cultures outside of your comfort zone, as well as how to push past some of the stigmas that exist within our South Asian community regarding following your dreams or passions. So, joining us in our conversation is Veena Murali, a 22-year-old solo female traveler who's traveled to a total of 55 plus countries and recently went on a journey around the world in 180 days solo trip. You can find our entire trip and experiences on our Instagram at NYC to Nomad, which we'll have in the description later. But without further ado, hi Vina. So nice to have you on our show. Welcome.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm so excited to be here and for our conversation today.
Of course. I guess so. Before we get into our kind of central topic, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm a 22-year-old Indian American woman. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and then moved to New York City for school. I had my first study abroad experience when I was a sophomore, and after that, just kind of got hooked on traveling. I had a little bit of a lapse there between COVID and not being able to travel, but once it kind of started easing off, I graduated a semester early from university to kind of go on this big solo trip with the intention of using travel as a tool for education, not just to learn more about other cultures and other people and other places, but also to learn about myself and how I could kind of take care of myself out traveling alone to all these countries. And it was seriously one of the best experiences of my life. So I'm super excited to share more today.
Yeah, I think it's really cool that you decided to use travel not only to learn about different cultures and like different things outside of your like perspective, but to also learn more about yourself. Like that's really interesting that you were able to use it as like a self growth tool. And I'm also curious to hear more about that too. Um, but for I guess for the first question, just to kind of start us off, what parts of when you were traveling around, what parts of the culture, or if there was anything that really, what did it resonate with you, or out of the things that you've most experienced from country to country? With it could be culture, it could be anything else, but just like what did you feel like stuck to you when you were traveling from country to country?
Yeah, so I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was just the people. I always say that the reason that I travel is because I'm curious as to what life is like in other places, not necessarily just to go to the prettiest places or the most Instagrammable places, but I genuinely want to go everywhere because I want to know what people's lives are like in other places. And I think the best way to really learn about that is by talking to people when you go to other places. And I think that's one thing that being a solo traveler has helped is that because I'm not surrounded by people that I know or friends that I'm already comfortable with, it really forced me to get out of my comfort zone and talk to locals. And that's when I got to like meet some of the most diverse ranges of people that I've ever met before. For example, in Georgia, I went to a wine tasting and the people that were running it were two 19-year-olds just like that went to high school in Georgia, and they were telling me about their experiences and speaking to
Cool.
people in Indonesia who, work in tourism and hearing about how COVID affected their daily livelihoods. Like when you live in the US, like, or anywhere that's like miles and miles away, when you read about these things in newspapers, it's just like, oh, that's happening over there. But when you go and travel to these places, it's like, this is affecting a real person and it's affecting their culture and their entire like country. And it's so amazing to see that. So I think that people are is definitely the biggest thing that resonated with me, and being able to meet so many people and having them obviously welcome me so warmly into their countries and tell me about what their lives were like was definitely the most memorable part.
I think that's really exciting because like we talk a lot on previous episodes where we've kind of mentioned this idea of like there's a lot of people within our community that I mean, not to generalize, but I feel like our scope of knowledge, maybe outside of our community as well, people like to live in their bubbles, and I think when we consume media within just America, it's like us and them sort of mentality, and it's very hard to put a group of people with like uh, realize that they're real people. They're It's not just a third world country. There is other countries out there that and there's politics and there's things, and I feel like people when we get stuck in a bubble and we don't push ourselves to explore those cultures or to understand them, or even, you know, it's very hard to see that as a see the countries as like a real thing. And
Yeah.
I think it's very important to push ourselves to identify and learn and explore other cultures and diversity, even if maybe we may not be able to go and travel as much, but just being open to getting to know those cultures is very important, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if you I like I guess kind of moving into our next question, like, it is a lot of like that us versus them mentality. And I think there's people, I think the media and stuff, they always portray like the differences between different countries. I kind of want to like dismantle that a little bit. Do you think, like, what do you think is like an overarching similarity between different countries as you've traveled from, different places?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that travel showed me, especially solo travel, is that it just restored my faith that humans are inherently good. Like, I received a lot more help than danger. I always get asked, "Did you ever feel like you were in danger?" And the answer is no. Like, no matter where I went, I felt completely comfortable. And I think the biggest similarity between everyone that I met anywhere is that people are so proud of their culture and so excited to share that with someone who has never experienced it before. Like, no matter what place you go to, everyone wants to tell you like their favorite foods, like what they do for holidays, like how they I don't know, how they practice their religion. Like, everyone is so overwhelmingly excited to see visitors, especially visitors in places like that don't get a lot of tourists. Like you said, in the media tends to over exaggerate places that are unfamiliar. For example, I traveled to Uzbekistan, and when I told people that I was doing that, they were like, "Is that safe? Like, that's crazy. Like, isn't that like, near Afghanistan and places that are like war torn and like, not don't really have a good rep in the media?" And yes, maybe it is closer in proximity than going to like Europe or something, but that doesn't mean that these places are dangerous if you do some research and obviously go into it with an open mindset, but also being prepared for, what it might be like. I found that the friendliest and most welcoming people in every single country that I went to were in Uzbekistan. Like, people were just so astounded to see someone from, far away United States come to Uzbekistan, and they were so excited to share with someone who is so curious to learn. And I think that that's like the places that you least expected it from had the most friendliest and most vibrant cultures that people were so excited to share about. And that goes for everywhere. Like, everywhere I went, people are so proud of their cultures and so excited to share that. And there's really nothing like, oh my God, they're not going to want to talk to a visitor, like they hate tourists, like nothing like that. I was genuinely so surprised by how kind people were everywhere. And I don't think I really had a bad experience meeting a local anywhere that I went.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point that you need to go in with an open mindset. And I think that's a really great advice to people who want to travel or just maybe are too scared because you're right, that attracts the right type of mentality and experience. And out of curiosity, is there a specific experience or moment that kind of stuck with you or like resonated with you in the sense that you found kind of like we were talking about before, where you were very surprised in how people were welcoming of you? Is there like a specific moment that kind of like you kind of hold close to you from your experiences?
Yeah, so I traveled with my dad to Saudi Arabia, and that is a country that not a lot of like people, I guess, in American media don't necessarily have a good like representation of. And obviously there are very good reasons for that. There's a lot of stuff that I don't agree with being done by the government there, but I think
Yeah.
what is important to realize is that people are not their governments. Like, when we went there and met so many people there, they were so excited to be like, "Oh my God, you are Indian, but you're also American," and asking about things that happen both in America, but also like, "Oh my God, I love biryani. It's my favorite food." Like, these are things that you wouldn't necessarily expect Saudi Arabia to, or as a government, to maybe have such close ties with either the Indian government or the US government. But when it comes down to people at a core, it's like people are the same no matter where you go. People love to talk about, their hobbies, food, like things they enjoy. Like, that is not going to change no matter what system of government you have. And I think that was something that so stuck with me, because when people asked me about my trip to Saudi Arabia, they were like, oh my God, like, why would you go there? Like, do you want to die? I'm like, no, like, it's really not that serious. Like, when I went there, people were so friendly and so excited. And I think, like, that was probably one of the countries that I went to that I was most kind of, that was like most kind of out there, like least traveled to. Like, I didn't know anyone who had been there. And it was kind of just like a moment of, like, for me, like, curiosity. Like, I'm curious what life is like here. And when I went there, like, there's still so many people who were so friendly and welcoming. And I think that's what stuck with me, is that the media can paint one completely different picture based on the government of a country, but there are still millions of people living in that country that do not agree with our government. And when I think about that, I think about, previous administrations in our own country. And I'm like, if that was the representation that other people have of America, that would also make me feel disappointed, because that's not what I stand for. And I have to think about that in the context of other governments around the world, which is what I think sometimes we fail to do when we trust American media too much.
Right, right. Yeah, I feel like you said, the media desensitizes everything, so you kind of forget the other end is also
Yeah.
human. And so, yeah, you're right. That's super important. And that's a really good segue into our next question, in the sense that, kind of focusing on the Indian side of our identity. Do you think our South Asian community is viewed or understood differently by society in other countries? Like, have you, I guess, some of the stereotypes that you've kind of seen of Indian people here, do you kind of see that anywhere else, or do you see a different image of the South Asian community, outside of America versus here? I guess, what is, from your experiences and what you could kind of infer to, what is like some of the perception of South Asian people, in the countries that you visited?
Yeah, so I think that it really, really differs across different places around the world. Like, for example, in the US and Australia and the United Kingdom, like, I think that places that are melting pots of, different racial and cultural, like, identities, I think that the South Asian community is very similar. And I think that we would be able to connect to an Indian British person or an Indian Australian person just as much as I could as an Indian American woman. But I do think that in other parts of Europe that are maybe more culturally homogenous or racially homogenous, there is definitely a different type of understanding of the South Asian community. And I don't want to speak too much on that, just, or like, I guess I don't really have the right words to say that because I don't live in those countries. But I do think that going places as a Indian American woman, such as maybe the Czech Republic or Hungary, where it's like a little bit more racially homogenous, I definitely felt like I stuck out a lot more than I expected. And people, it is like a much bigger part of your identity as a traveler. Like, people will come up to you and be like, are you from India? As opposed to, if I go to Australia, people are not going, I mean, yes, I look Indian, but it's not like the immediate, I guess, conclusion is that I am from India. Like, I could be from Australia, but also Indian. So I think that traveling to countries like Eastern Europe and maybe other places in that region, it's definitely like people had a little bit more of a stigma, I guess, against South Asian communities, just because they are less inviting of other races and other cultural groups in, like, well, coming into their society, or just because that is just how their country is made up of. But I think when I went to Southeast Asia and I went to countries like Singapore and Malaysia, like, you see so much of an Indian population there. And there it's just like a huge, like, there like in Singapore and Malaysia, like, the Indian minority or Indian part of the population is a much bigger group of the population than is in, for example, like America. So in Singapore, to go and see that Tamil is one of the national languages, like, that was so interesting to me, because I speak Tamil and I feel like I don't speak it enough when I am in the US. But to see it there, and it is also like a very developed country, but you hear Tamil on the subways on the subway stations and things like that. It's like the South Asian community is such a obviously big part of the world everywhere, but in some places it has like a like it affects the way of life in a lot more influential way than it does, for example, in the US or in Australia or the UK. And in other racially homogenous countries, it doesn't affect it at all. So I think that was super interesting to me, to think about what would my life have been like if I was born as a South Asian woman but somewhere else that wasn't the US. And I think that also made me really grateful for the fact that I live and have been brought up in the US, because I do feel like if I had been born somewhere where there was not as much of a community, it would have definitely changed my identity so immensely. So it taught me a lot about being grateful for the diversity that I've been brought up within, having lived in, New York and Chicago and being surrounded by a strong South Asian community for most of my life. I've realized like how lucky that was, because it doesn't necessarily exist everywhere and people aren't always as open and inviting and things like that everywhere.
Right, and I think that it's really it's understandable, like you said, like a homogenous, like it's similar to the concept of traveling in the sense that like you have to have be open to learning new things and have a different perspective. Like that's why a lot of people go to travel. And I feel like you can put that parallel into like if you had to like break down the U.S. a little bit more, I feel like you bring that parallel in as well, not just like other homogenous countries. Like for example, like southern countries or like areas like where there wouldn't be a diverse setting. Let's just say like the middle of nowhere, Indiana. Like I think I have some friends who have come from those backgrounds who have like told me like, hey, you're the first Indian person I've ever seen, and you kind of have the similar challenges that you were mentioning at the not challenges, but like different those types of conversations that you had in those countries with those individuals as well. So it's interesting that a lot of the things that you were noticing abroad is also kind of can be seen as well in the US.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like I even like especially after having traveled, I like have come to the realization that I can't live anywhere in the US that is not a big city, because having to
Yeah.
go through that type of experience is just something that I've been lucky to never have gone through in my life. But I, like you said, I've met so many people who are like, I was like one of the only three South Asian people in my high school, or like I never had friends that celebrated Diwali. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I just can't believe that. And obviously it's, it happens and it's real, but it's just for me, I'm like, I could never imagine my identity without it. So it really is crazy that just in our own country, I mean, it's obviously a huge country, but still there's so many differing experiences of what it means to be South Asian.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say like I think it's like also interesting like the US specifically, I don't think people realize like how diverse it really is, like not just in the way like the types of people that exist and the race and like the cultural aspects, but also the ways of living, you know? Like the way that people live in say the East Coast is so different from the way that people live in the West Coast, and like the way that the cities are structured, the way that everything is organized, like the systems of power, like who the minorities, the majorities are all different in different places. So I feel like even if I feel like having that diversity around us is very hard to like find similar or kind of similar ground. And I think, like you said, I think you mentioned like going to other countries that are not as accepting of, and that's just like not what they first think of when they see Indian people because they're just not used to it, or they're not as welcoming it because that's just what they've been taught for a very long time. Like I think there's as much as I am all for like, oh, we should all be happy and be all together, I think we need to identify our differences in order to come to be able to talk with each other a little bit more, because I feel like that's where the divide in the US comes. Everyone is just like, I don't want to hang out with anyone on the other side of this political division. And I feel like in order to cross that, we need to be a little bit more understanding on both sides. And I think that's so difficult given everything that's going on in the US. Everything just seems so polarized now, and it really just makes me kind of angry because, if you, I feel like in order to understand the diversity and the cultural aspects of other people, or I feel like we need to bridge that gap, but it's becoming so divided. I don't know if you had any thoughts. I know that was kind of a loose connection, but I would like to get your thoughts on that, and like maybe some ways that we can some things that we can do here to learn about other cultures and diversity, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to polarization in the US, I completely agree. And I think that it comes from the fact that we are so focused here on what we don't have and what we want more of and what is wrong with our country, as opposed to thinking of what we already have. And I think that, yes, I understand that there are a lot of things that need to be fixed in the US, but traveling abroad showed me how we have so much more as American citizens or American residents or just living in this country than so many people abroad do. For example, we forget that we can write anything on the internet and have almost no consequences. You can write anything about any politician and no one is going to come for you. Like as a
Very
woman, you
true.
can work any job, you can study anything you want, you can go to any university, you can wear anything you want on the street. Like those are things that I feel like, yes, for us they're so basic and we think, oh my god, like we couldn't, like we'd never have to live without that. But having that basic gratitude and realizing that there are so many places around the world where that is not a basic right, I think realizing the things that we do have is something that would be effective in helping bring us together, because there are a lot of things that both sides of the political spectrum agree on. Like we agree on freedom of speech, we agree on, right to education and things of that nature. So I think that that is one way to kind of bridge the gap between whatever differences exist on both the political spectrum but also across cultures. Like yes, there are some religions or cultures that traditionally are not thought to get along, but at the base, like a lot of those religions share similar values and a lot of the cultures share similar roots and histories. And I think that looking to our similarities and realizing that even if they are basic things or small things, the fact that though they became basic things because we are so used to them and they are such big parts of our lives, I think is something that we all forget to do, including myself. I complain way too much about this country when it has, obviously it's one of still a country that so many people, when I visited other countries, were like, that is my dream. It's my dream to live in the US, but it's so hard to immigrate there. Like thinking about the fact that I was born here, I did nothing to get here, is something that I think of every day. And I remind myself every time I feel like I have something to say, to complain about living here.
Right, right. Um, I guess kind of switching gears now, into I know, so you noted, when we were messaging back and forth earlier on email, you noted that there aren't that many Desi solo travelers, especially Desi female solo travelers. Can you speak more on that? Why do you think there's a lack of interest in this area within our community?
Yeah, so that was one of the biggest things that I noticed, is that I would go and stay in a lot of hostels or join a lot of tours and activities and groups where it was mostly like solo travelers that stay in hostels and things like that. And I would never see any Desi or South Asian female solo travelers. Like I would be the only one. Like there would be a lot of European solo travelers, Australians, and even like East Asians, but never really any South Asians. And that was like so disheartening to me. Not disheartening, but like not even disappointing, but I was just like, I wish there were more. I don't know how to put that into words, but
Yeah.
like why I created the my Instagram. I was like, I want to inspire more South Asian and Desi females to travel alone because it is not as scary as you think. And I think that I don't know if it's a lack of interest, but I do think that every time I speak to one of my Desi friends and I'm like, they're like, oh, I really want to go to this place, but I don't have anyone to go with. I'm like, well, you can just go alone. Like, you don't need to wait for someone. They're like, but I'd be so bored, or how would I like get around, or things like that. And I don't know if I can categorize that as a lack of interest, but maybe it's just a lack of exposure. Like, they don't see that that many people do it. Like, if like for them, it's like still like, oh, like you went alone. Like, what did you even do alone? Like, weren't you bored? What would you do on a trip alone? But I can do the same things on a trip alone that I would do taking a trip with one other person or two other people. So I think it's just that there are not enough people in the community doing it. Like that people see that and they're like, oh, that's so normal. Like I can totally go on a trip by myself. Like I don't really need someone else to go. And I think that's why there is a lack of solo female travelers. So I'm hoping that if I can start getting more people on board, hopefully more people start to realize that you don't need to wait for someone else to go on that trip. You don't need to wait to have a boyfriend or a friend group or anything to go on a trip by yourself. Like those places are out there waiting, and no one's going to like convince you to go unless you convince yourself. So, yeah.
No, that's a really
Do you
good
think
point.
that
Go ahead, Sneha, go ahead.
Sorry. Do you think that's because people feel like that, as a female, it's more likely that it's not safe for you? Is there like a safety aspect, do you think, for the reason why people are like, is it like a fear thing, or do you think it's just because people would rather go with the group than alone?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both because, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I do think that in the South Asian community, it is a little bit more sheltered than maybe other cultures, like especially for girls, we are taught not to like go out and do things like alone, or like, you know, that things are can be unsafe and whatnot. And yes, that's true, but also it, like for me, I think about, okay, I live in New York City, so how much safer is me going out by myself to go run errands than me going and visiting a museum in Paris alone? Like when you start to think about safety as and putting into perspective the place that you live as opposed to places abroad. Like I know that walking outside at 10 p.m. in Singapore alone, even though it's thousands of miles away, is still more safe than me walking outside at 10 p.m. in New York City alone. But if I told, you
Right.
know, my aunts and uncles that I did one over the other because I live in New York City, they're going to be like, "Oh, that's completely normal." But you went to Singapore like alone and you like, you know, navigated your way around, like that sounds completely more mind-boggling to them. But when you put in the context of safety around the world, like I'm not saying that people should travel to Saudi Arabia alone on their first trip. Like that, you know, I understand why people might have qualms about that, but you can certainly go to places like Australia and Singapore and Japan and places that have good records for safety alone. But I do think that people still have something holding them back where they're like, I don't want to go there alone because I would feel like I'm bored or I wouldn't know what to do and things like that. So, yes, safety is definitely a component, but I do think it is an easily resolvable issue because you can go places that you know are going to be safe. Um, but again, I do understand that there's a stigma that, you know, women are going to be a danger no matter where they go, which I personally don't have not found to be true in certain places around the world. But again, a stigma exists because many people believe it. And I know that there's a lot of steps to be taken before you dismantle that kind of stigma.
Right. I feel like you said, especially in the South Asian community, you're kind of conditioned to, I mean, even not just in South Asia. I think for just women in general, you're kind of
Yeah.
conditioned to have like that third eye or like that perspective of always being alert. And so, like you said, if you've never traveled solo before, that intimidation factor is just a lot larger. Um, but like I like how you put it in the sense of you should look at safety in relative to what you where you are now versus like abroad because you're totally right. I was just thinking about my personal experiences like of living in certain inner city areas for school and then me like kind of being kind of scared to travel by myself in this XYZ area and I'm like why was I scared? They're basically like I lived in a little bit quote unquote dangerous area in comparison. So that's a really great way of putting it in terms of getting over that fear.
I think also like I like the idea of like, you know, imagine you're living there as opposed to just traveling there. I think that's very important because I think there is like a mentality when people go abroad, quote, travel, there are some people who won't venture out beyond just like the typical kind of like touristy sort of things, and which is fine. But I think the way that people view those kind of like tourist trap stuff is like, oh, this is a vacation. You know, I'm not living here, so the rules are different. And I feel like seeing a country through those lens as opposed to actually trying to meet the people who live there or like getting to know them or like even living with them or doing like a kind of, you know, those student exchange programs,
Mm-hmm.
like I think you get a different experience from that that I think people don't really value. And I think the difference there is what you said, where people are going to these countries who people who go to these countries and imagine themselves living there have kind of a different experience and understanding of that culture. Um, so I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, like like which. I guess my question, like it was more of like a statement of like, you know, this is the state of things, and I think that's important. Um, but I don't know what if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree because I think that another thing that when I tell people like, oh, I'm like going to this place alone or like, you know, you should go alone, it's like who's going to take my photos or like who's going to do stuff.
Yeah.
That is not the point of
Right, right.
travel. And for those people that go there and want to just go to the tourist destinations and take their pretty pictures and wear a pretty dress and take their photos, like, yes, that's one way of travel. But again, for the people who do want to travel like that, like going solo is less appealing of an option. But if you really want to travel authentically and experience life like what a local person would be like, and you want to take public transit, and you want to walk everywhere, and you want to eat the local foods, and you want to speak to local people and just kind of experience the culture. Like, I think going solo is actually a great way of doing that, because you are more open to meeting new people and trying places that, and you don't need to go with the flow of a group. Like, if the group wants to eat at this fancy restaurant, like, you kind of have out when you're on a group trip, you kind of have to just go with what everyone else wants to do. But when I was traveling alone, like, I could just eat at any street food place that I saw and just strike up a conversation with the person working there. And I think that that type of travel is very there are two very distinct types of travel, and I think that that's why um yeah, like, I think, like, and people come away from these trips with very different perceptions of what it means to be a traveler and what it means to be a tourist and what different countries are like. So I do think, like you said, like, different modes of travel do really affect how likely someone is to come away with one type of understanding, and also come up, like, be open to solo travel and really, like, pushing the limits of what it means to travel, like, I guess, intentionally.
Yeah, kind of going back to the like desi female solo traveler perspective, that you have, you basically you are they see female solo traveler. I did want to ask a question in the sense of, I know that that's a really like that mindset in terms of going out and exploring and just to kind of live in experiences might be a little different perspective to what individuals may think in the South Asian community in general if they were to like hear something like that. And you've kind of touched like briefly hinted on those types of aspects earlier, but like how have you personally kind of had to deal with that in maybe like maybe relatives or like extended family or people in your community when they maybe heard that you were going to go on this journey around the world and like they tried to either maybe like make you hesitate a little bit or anything? How did you kind of navigate those conversations, especially being a Daisy female solo traveler? Just so that maybe if someone listening has a similar aspiration to travel, how could they potentially navigate through those conversations you might have had to face?
Yeah, I love this question because it is one of my favorite things to tell people is, how did you convince your parents, or how did you even do this? So I think that I took my first solo trip when I was studying abroad, because everyone else wanted to kind of like, everyone else had other plans that weekend to go somewhere else. And I was like, okay, I don't want to waste a weekend. So I just want to go alone. And at first my parents were like, oh my gosh, like, you cannot go alone. Like, obviously, like, as any Indian parent would say, like, you are alone. But I think that over time I was able to show them by starting small that I could do this big trip. So for example, like, I live in New York City, so that means I can start off by going on a small trip to Brooklyn by myself and spending the day, or I live in Manhattan, so I can go to Brooklyn and spend the day by myself. And that is in one way traveling by myself, because I went to a different place, I navigated and figured out things to do. And no, it's not as big as, like, going to London alone, but it's still a good start for someone who has never traveled anywhere alone, who has parents that have apprehensions about them doing things alone. You can say that, okay, I did this small thing alone. After that, maybe you take a trip to a different state alone. Like, maybe you fly to California alone and you spend a week in San Francisco alone, living in a big city. So you're not, like, in the middle of nowhere. Like, obviously, like, parents do not want you to go and go to dangerous places, so obviously start small, go places that they will be okay with, like New York City, LA, San Francisco, things like that, where people are generally like, know those places, and you can go and stay with a friend or like meet up with a friend, and they'll feel so much more comfortable with that. And those are small steps to be like, okay, now I want to actually take this trip to, let's say, London, or somewhere that is more, I guess, on the tourist path, like Paris and places that have really good infrastructure for tourists. So then, like, why don't you show them that I can go domestically, now I can go international, but it's not like I'm going completely out of my comfort zone, because people in London speak English, like people in Paris know what it's like to help out a tourist. And once you do that, you kind of show them that you can do this. Like, it is not as scary as they think to go to a different country alone. Like, you will make it back. You might, feel uncomfortable, or you might have some difficulties getting a taxi, but it is not the end of the world to be uncomfortable. And I think a lot of Indian parents don't understand that. Like, they don't want their kids to be uncomfortable at all. Like, they want everything to
Yeah.
be, like, super easy, and nothing to go wrong. And that is never going to happen when you travel, but that is okay. And I think taking those small steps to show them that I did this and I was fine. I did this and I was fine. I did this and I was fine. And then finally, like once they have the confidence that it is not as scary as you think, is that push when you can be like, okay, now I want to go on a trek to the Himalayas alone, which is kind of one of the things that I did. So I think that over time, I lived in New York City and did a bunch of things alone. And then I studied abroad and took small weekend trips alone. And I showed my parents that, these are things that I was able to do and I survived and that they were really fun for me as well. And I was like, okay, well, I want to take this 6 month trip. And I think by that time they had really adapted like their mentality. And I am lucky enough that I have more chill parents than I guess like average. So they were very like open and supportive of all of this, which I'm super grateful for. But it definitely did take some convincing over time. But I do think like start small is my biggest tip. Stay within their comfort zone as well at the beginning and show them that this is something that is possible. And eventually you'll be able to do something big when you are comfortable as well as when your parents or relatives are comfortable.
I think that's important because like you said, like I think parents, our parents within the community. I feel like there's a tendency to exaggerate, like, or make them into sort of a villain or someone that's untouchable and someone you can't fight or argue or do anything with. And I think that's just not true. I think there are ways to convince parents to see and appreciate and see what you're doing. And I think ultimately, I feel like most Indian parents just want to see the best for their kids. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're showing them and happiness for their children. So if you're showing them that this makes you happy and you're showing them that you are able to, handle the level of commitment and research and involvement that would be required to, explore and do different things, I think the more open they will be and more trusting they will be of you trying different things. I think it's super important, to open that communication, if possible, with your parents. I know there are some, outliers in which that might not be possible, and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, like, I think giving them the benefit of the doubt is always kind of a good thing. Um, but I guess, like, in so we kind of talked about the concern, like the safety concerns in specifics, but let's kind of move into, I know the other big concern would probably be, the expense of travel. So, for people who are otherwise unable to travel due to financial reasons, how do you think one can, like, broaden their understanding of the world without having to leave the country, which might not be doable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this question too, because I truly believe that you do not have to get on a plane. You don't have to, like even get on a train or a car to truly travel. I think travel is just going to a new place with in search of a new experience or in search of knowledge or some sort of, new, just, yeah, like seeing something new. And I think that you can do that even in your own city. For example, if you live in like New York City, for example, and you want to experience a new culture, like I think that people in who live in Manhattan too often do not leave Manhattan. I don't know if anyone listening has a experience of living in New York City, but I do think that so many of the neighborhoods outside of Manhattan are so incredibly diverse. Like you go to Jackson Heights and you have a huge South Asian community and a huge Pakistani and Indian and Nepali community. And you go to Astoria and they have a huge Greek population and you can see so many Greek restaurants and grocery stores. And I think that seeking out places that are not, convenient or not like, don't have the coolest bars or not like the most trendiest on whatever social media. Like when you go to places outside of what is on the typical path of your city, like I think you can learn so much. Just from how diverse the US is. And I think that living in the US is also just such a blessing because there are so many places where you can go simply within the country and learn so much. Like, for example, the Southwest US has such a different culture than the Northeast. And you can learn so much about Latino culture by going to Miami or going to Texas and things like that, and without even leaving the country. So I think that one, if you don't want to leave the country, there are so many places in the US where you can experience a different culture. But if you don't even want to take a plane or take a train, like I would say experience your own city, like go to a new neighborhood, try a new food, like read a new book, like try like go to a grocery store and just look at what the products that other cultures use to cook are, like go to like I don't know, a new temple, or like visit, or if it's like Chinese New Year, like every city has huge celebrations for that. You don't have to be Chinese to go and see and experience that. So I think that there's so many ways to get involved in learning about new cultures. You just kind of have to put aside that mentality of, oh, like I can't go that, or like that's not cool, or like, you know, I wouldn't be like welcome there or something like that. Like I think that if you truly want to learn, there are so many opportunities to do that, without, you know, getting on a plane or getting on a train. You can really find anything you want, in your own hometown.
Yeah, and to kind of extend that question, I guess traveling on a budget is also very important. I'm assuming if you have to travel for like long periods of time, like you said, 6 months. Do you have any tips or advice on that area? Because I know that also ties a little bit with like the traveling experience itself too.
Yeah, so I would say, like, if you truly want to, there are, like we said, there are different types of travel. And for people that want to travel luxuriously, I would say spending a long time traveling is just not an option unless you have endless funds, which I did not. So I did not travel luxuriously at all. I stayed in hostels, which meant like sharing a room with multiple people, sharing a bathroom with like 10 to 15 people every night. And for me, like, I obviously was not as comfortable as being in my own bed every night. And like I had some nights where it was super loud, or like was in bathrooms that weren't the cleanest. But for me, if that meant that I was able to spend another day in a new country, like that was totally fine to me. I would spend the whole day out. So just like having a bed to sleep at night that wasn't like as comfortable as a nice hotel bed wasn't, was like a sacrifice I was willing to make. I also never checked in a bag anywhere, which meant, yes, my photos didn't have the cutest outfits, and I didn't, you know, look super nice every day and have like a different outfit for lunch and dinner. But for me, that cut the cost of, you know, paying for baggage. And for me, like wearing the same five outfits and just doing laundry every week, when I was away, it was like a sacrifice I was willing to make. And I'd never take an Uber, like always walk or public transit. And yes, these are maybe things that are harder to figure out in new countries, or maybe less familiar or more uncomfortable, or take extra research. But if you are willing to travel and you know that you only have X amount of money to do so, and travel is your biggest priority, I think that you can go to any length or most lengths to kind of make that happen. You just have to be willing to give up some of the comforts that you have at home, because, you know, travel is very expensive and it's a privilege to travel. But I do think that different budgets can have, different styles of travel can be managed with different budgets, which makes it still possible to go somewhere, and hopefully that's the goal.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up our episode today, just some few questions left. What do you hope to see for yourself in your future in the sense of traveling, or maybe kind of your growth in whatever area you're wanting to explore in your life? And are there any other countries on the list of your bucket list, or anything that you kind of want to visit, or maybe you'd revisit from your past experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I can't name a single country in the world that I wouldn't want to visit. So I do think that, in my future, I do hope to travel as much as possible. I always say that my dream one day would be to just visit every single country in the world, but I do know that's a very, very far off, very expensive, and very time consuming goal. But it is, I don't know, like a big dream to have, I guess. But yeah, I mean, for now, I am. So I did my trip when I had graduated early, and I had a gap like semester to take. But for now, I'm back to normal life working. So just making the most of weekend trips and that sort. So I do think that, you know, that has been like a, I guess, like the challenge of balancing your time when you work like a corporate job and also want to spend as much time traveling as possible. So that is like another challenge, which I'm sure could be like a whole other episode. But I do think that travel is a priority for me in my life, and I will keep doing whatever it takes to travel as much as possible. So, yeah, that's hopefully where I guess my future will be, with just as much travel as possible, and hopefully more international travel, as I kind of, as the holidays near, hopefully.
It's amazing, and I hope that happens. That is a huge goal, but I think if anyone was gonna do it, I can see you doing it. So that's very exciting.
Thank
Very,
you.
very cool. Um, but I guess like okay, so final question. What and you kind of touched on this earlier, but just as a lasting thought, why do you think it's so important for people, specifically South Asian women, to push themselves out of their comfort zone and pursue what they want to pursue, despite maybe the stigmas within our community or roadblocks that they might face?
I think that my mantra is always you never know until you go. And I think that we always have so many preconceived notions of what it's going to be like when we do something uncomfortable or something scary and something we're unsure of. But once you actually do that thing, you realize I've never done anything that I regret and that I look back on and I'm like, oh my God, I should not have pushed myself outside of my comfort zone at that point. And I think that a lot of people can resonate with that, and that when you do something that's outside of your comfort zone, you never look back and you're like, oh my God, that was such a wrong decision. And I think that that one step to get there and push yourself out of your comfort zone is the hardest one. But once you do it, you realize that you are capable of so much more than you are ever thought. And I think that South Asian women and women are not told that enough. Like, we are not told that you are capable of so much more than you could ever imagine. And I think that by doing these things and pursuing the things that we want to do, we have to show this to ourselves and kind of build that confidence together. So I think, yeah, you never know until you go. And I think pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone and seeking discomfort is one of the most important things you can do to build self confidence and live a fulfilled life.
That's amazing. And thank you so much, Veena, for taking time out of your day to have this wonderful conversation with us. For our listeners, check out Veena's Instagram profile at NYC to Nomad, which we will put in our description, which journals her entire journey around the world in 180 days solo trip. So go give it a follow. Again, Veena, thanks again for joining us. This is great. Amazing to get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been super fun. And yeah, I'm excited for everyone to hopefully check out my page and send me a message if you want to chat or literally anything. I would love to meet anyone and have a conversation about travel.
So before you kind of leave us today, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Ravi Ray Audio. You might have heard that our intro and outro music is a little bit different this season and is definitely upgraded to a next level. That's all thanks to Ravi Ray, who was our last guest in season 2, and he agreed to help us out with our music for season 3. So thank you so much, Ravi Ray, for all your help. And if you guys want to get in contact with him to collaborate with any projects or work with Ravi Ray Audio, we are linking his information to the episode description so you can reach out to him or see all the other projects he's done. And thanks again, Ravi, and we'll see you guys all in the next one.